Okay, good Shabbos. All right, so this week's parasha is Parashat Chayei Sarah. And in this parasha, we have two funerals and a wedding. Okay, so we will, of course, start off with the story of the death of Sarah. Sarah passes away and Abraham has to buy the cave of Machpelah. And then majority of the parasha has to do with the wedding or the marriage of Rebecca, who gets, Eliezer goes and fetches her from Aram Naraim and brings her back to Isaac, and they get married. And then right at the end of this week's parasha, we have another death and funeral, of course, this time of Avraham Avinu, our father. And this week's parasha is actually very important for Jewish tradition and Jewish history, because it's from this week's parasha that we learn majority of our customs and lessons on how to perform a funeral, how to mourn for a funeral, what to do, how to eulogize, all these types of things. And similarly, we learn just as many halachot when it comes to the idea of marriage. How do you marry? Why do you marry? What are the steps to getting married? All of that we learn from this week's parasha. So we learn about death and marriage. Okay? And contrary to popular belief, these two things are different. Right? They are actually polar opposites. They're not meant to be similar. They're polar opposite things, right? They're completely different spectrums. The emotions you go through are absolutes on the other sides of the poles, right? One has to do with the most joyous day of your life. The other one has to do with probably the saddest day of your life when the loved ones close to you lose their life. And the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, of course, there is a time for everything. There is a time for joy and there is a time for mourning, right? And you would think we're supposed to separate these two as much as possible. But sometimes, unfortunately, life happens. It's not always just black and white. There's a big gray area in between, and that is where we operate in this lifetime. And sometimes it happens that maybe during the week of your wedding, you might have to also plan a funeral. Nobody knows. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but God forbid, may it never happen to any of us. But this is still a reality. It possibly can still happen, and it does in fact happen in this week's parasha. Now, I just separated Sarah's funeral and then the wedding and then Abraham's funeral later. So they don't overlap over there anyway. To find out where they overlap, we have to dig a little bit deeper into this week's parasha, a little bit deeper than 6 feet to try and find out exactly where they overlap. All right, so we all know the story. Majority of the parasha talks about Abraham sending Eliezer to find a wife for his son Isaac from his family in Aram Naraim, right, far away. And Abraham says to Eliezer, do not worry, because God will send an angel before you. Does anyone know what happened to this angel? Does the Torah tell us? It says the angel's going to go ahead of you, but did you see the angel make an appearance anywhere? We don't really, right? So there's a bunch of different suggestions from our commentators. Some say it was this angel that made Rebecca go and fetch the water. Or it was this angel that made the water rise up to Rebecca, so it was easy for her to pick up the water. Right? Those are some of the suggestions. Rashi, on the other hand, he has a different job for the angel that I want to explore today. Because when Eliezer sees Rebecca and he sees the kindness she shows and realizes this is the one who's going to marry my master's son Isaac, he follows her back to the house of Laban and Bethuel. Okay, we know these two characters from the parasha, Lavan and Bethuel, right? The father of Rebecca and the brother of Rebecca. So he follows them back, and they eventually start the negotiations, right? Laban decides to go and feed the camels and polish all the gold jewelry that he brought with and the diamonds, just to put them on display, just for in case, you know. And they go into the house and they start their negotiations. So much so that the Torah tells us Lavan and Bethuel said, this is surely from God. They acknowledge that this is without a doubt a miracle from God. And then Laban and Bethuel talk with Eliezer more, and Laban and Bethuel talk with Eliezer more, and Laban and Bethuel do more and more and more. Over and over again, Laban and Bethuel are mentioned. They have supper together that night, and they go to sleep before the next morning when the negotiations are completed. Now, in verse 55, which is now the next morning, it says the following. Laban and his mother said to Eliezer, not Laban and Bethuel, Laban and his mother said to Eliezer, let Rebecca stay here for another year, or even for 10 months. And Eliezer says, can't do that, I got to get going. So Rashi obviously is bothered by this. He asked the question. This whole time in the section, he's been telling us Laban and Bethuel, Laban and Bethuel, Laban and Bethuel. The next morning, Laban and her mother. Where did Bethuel go, asks Rashi. It's been bothering Rashi. Where did he go? Because after this, Bethuel is not mentioned again in the Torah. He disappears off the scene. Where did he go? In that dark, starry night. So Rashi comes and gives us the answer by quoting from the Midrash. The Midrash tells us the story about Bethuel, that Bethuel actually tried to stop the wedding that night. Even though he gave his word and said, this is from God, we'll do it. Bethuel was a sneaky character. Where do you think Laban learned it from? From his father. He tried to stop the wedding that night, and the angel that God sent ahead of Eliezer actually came and killed Bethuel that night. So we found our missing angel. Okay? Now, how did this happen and why did this happen? I think I've told you guys a story about 3 or 4 years ago. I mentioned the story of how this happened. Let me just recap for you exactly what happened, and we'll learn a point from it. So at the supper the night before, the Midrash tells us that Bethuel brought food. The Torah actually tells us they put food before Eliezer. And it says, Bethuel tried to give Eliezer some poison soup. Some poison soup, right? And we actually have a proof text for this. Verse 33, Genesis 24, verse 33 says the following. Food was placed before Eliezer, but Eliezer said, I will not eat this food until I have spoken my words. So just like in the movies or in the cartoons where you find these stories of people trying to give you a poison chalice, the cup starts passing hands and it moves around, right? And the Midrash tells us what actually happened here was that while Eliezer was telling this extremely long story, by the way, you read the parasha and you think to yourself, have I not read this before? Why does it repeat the entire story again? Maybe this is the reason why. Because while Eliezer was telling this story, Bethuel started getting sleepy, and the angel came and did the old switcheroo. He took his cup of soup and put it under there. And next thing you knew, Bethuel started getting hungry, drank his poison soup, and he was the one who ended up poisoning himself. Now, interesting story, right? Do we find it anywhere in the Bible? In the text? Did our sages just suck this out of their thumb, pull it out of the clouds? We actually have a proof text for this. If you've got a Chumash or a Hebrew Bible close by, one that's actually got the Hebrew, you can actually check this out. We find this in Genesis 24, verse 33. Okay, this is our proof text because the proof is in the pudding, right? The poison pudding. So let's find out here. Now, the Hebrew word for poison is the word sam. Sam, basically S-U-M or S-A-M. Sam is the Hebrew word for poison. Now, we find this in Genesis 24, verse 33. If you've got a Chumash, check this out in Genesis 24, 33. In the Hebrew, you'll notice that in the column of your Chumash, just look in the column, there's one word that stands out completely separate from the text in the column. And that one is spelled with vowels. It's the word vayusam. It's got a little asterisk, so it's got a little marker there in your column. Now, the reason why it's written there in the column is because in the text itself of the Hebrew, we are not given the vowels. Because we find this quite often in the Torah, that many times we find something written a certain way, but it's pronounced a different way. And the only way to know what the word actually is rely on tradition. So tradition tells us what the word is meant to be read like. So that's why it's like that. So the word itself over there, which is vayusum, I think it is, vayusum, we have to rely on tradition to tell us how to pronounce that word, which of course gives our rabbis a lot of license to play around with the word. They tell us another tradition of how you should be reading that word is not vayasum, that they placed before him food, but you should read vayahi sam. What is sam? I told you earlier. Poison. So it should be saying, it is poison food that they placed before Eliezer. So there's the proof text for the fact that they actually tried, that Bethuel tried to poison Eliezer. The only other place in the book of Genesis where we find this particular word, vayisem, in a different form at least, used is right in the very last verse of Genesis, where old Joseph dies, and what do the Egyptians do with his body? They mummify him, right? And then it says they place him in a coffin, using the exact same word, vayisem. So both places we find this word used has to do with trying to get rid of somebody and put them to sleep. Right? It has to do with death. Vayasem ha'aron is what they say actually about old Joseph. So that very night, what happened was Bethuel, after drinking his own poison soup, he ends up dying. It was his last supper of Bethuel. Now, I say last supper for a reason. Because when I was trying to prepare this week, trying to think what I'm going to speak about, This whole week long, I was thinking, I've got to find a connection that connects to the Last Supper of Yeshua. Because, you know, there's a story in the beginning of this parasha where Eliezer sees Rebecca with a jar on her shoulder. And I thought to myself, that sounds familiar. In the New Testament, when Yeshua prepares for the Last Supper, he tells his disciples, go into the city and you will find a man carrying a jar of water on his shoulder. I thought, I have to go into this because there must be a connection. Not only that, we also find at the Last Supper, what happens? What do we do on Pesach night? We read and we read and we read the Magid, the telling of the story. And we look at the food, but we can't eat it yet because we have to read more. And we look at the food again, and there's 4 questions that the kids ask, right? There's actually a question the adults ask. That question is, when do we eat? The exact same thing is happening with Eliezer and Bethuel, right? Bethuel brings out the food and says, let's eat. Eliezer says, I first have to speak all my words. I have to tell the story. I have to give you the Magid. The same thing happened at Yeshua's Last Supper as well. And where do we start the Magid with? We start by saying, my father was a wandering Aramean. Who is it talking about? None other than Laban, who tried to kill us and wipe out our entire lineage. Speaking about this week's story and next week's story of Laban, the Aramean, and what he did to us. Not only that, what was the water used for? That water that was in the jar of both Rebecca and this gentleman in Jerusalem. They used that water in both stories to wash feet. Right? Yeshua, of course, washed his disciples' feet. And he told them, I do this for you as your rabbi and your teacher, teaching you a lesson to be servants unto one another. Do not be arrogant and think you're important. You shall serve each other as I served you. Just like Eliezer, right? Eliezer, his name is not even mentioned in this parasha because he is the ultimate servant of his master. And of course, he washes his feet as well. And not only that, just like the poison food, I often think about old Judas and the bitter food that he shared with Yeshua. But are the connections, do these connections make any sense? I don't think so. So I just wanted to point that out. That's how I got to where I was today. Like, I couldn't put it together. I couldn't figure out what's going on. But anyway, I want to share with you a different lesson that we learned from the story here and from the death of Bethuel in this week's parasha. Because it's different to the other deaths in this week's parasha. With the death of Sarah, we find a funeral, we find mourning, we find customs. With the death of Abraham at the end, we find even Ishmael came back for the funeral and they buried him in a place that they purchased. What do we know about the funeral of Bethuel, Rivka's father? What does Rivka do? Absolutely nothing. If anything, she leaves town the next day. She does not go to the funeral. She does not mourn. She does nothing. She runs away from her family. Why would Rebecca, our matriarch, do something like that? And in fact, we actually see this in the words of her mother and Laban the next morning. Because what did they request of Eliezer? They said, let her stay for an entire year, maybe even 10 months. Why? So she can mourn, so she can do the mourner's kaddish even for an entire year for her father. But they don't do that. And we just learned from the story of Abraham burying Sarah, the importance of burying your dead. The importance of eulogizing your dead. The importance of sitting Shiva for the 7 days before you can arise from your dead. That's what Abraham did, right? It says, and then he arose from his dead. We just learned we're supposed to do that. Why on earth is she not doing this? We refer to this as the Geminot Chasadim. One of the greatest acts of loving kindness you can do for a person is once they die and pass away, you have to look after them. Do the funeral. Honor the deceased. Why did Rebecca, our matriarch, decide to leave, to get up and go? To vat jou goed en trek, Ferreira. It's one of the 44 Afrikaans people in our country there. All right. Why did she decide to leave? Well, I think this has something to do with the same idea that Yeshua brings out for us in the gospel in Luke chapter 9, where he says to one of his disciples, follow me. And the disciple says, yeah, sure, but let me just first go bury my father and then I'll follow you. And what does Yeshua say? Let the dead bury the dead. That sounds quite extreme if you ask me. Aren't we supposed to be showing honor to the dead? Is this not one of the greatest mitzvahs you can do as a human being? So commentators have come along over the years and suggested many different things as to what Yeshua meant when he said, let the dead bury the dead. Some say, oh, it was just a spiritual death that he was talking about. Others are a lot more practical and say, in Judaism, you're supposed to bury the dead the day they die, right? So there's no chance this guy was out there following Yeshua and then all of a sudden decided, oh, my dad just died. I got the smoke signal and I have to go bury him. So it was probably the idea of how back in those days, remember you used to die and then they would take your body and put you in a cave for about a year, and then they would come back eventually, take your bones and put them in an ossuary and bury your bones. That's probably what was going on there. But regardless of what actually happened there and why Yeshua said it, I think there's a bigger lesson that Yeshua was trying to teach us by what he said when he said, let the dead bury the dead. Because the main point he was trying to bring across to this disciple is that nothing else takes priority over following the Messiah, following God. If God tells you come, don't worry about the dead. You listen to God. And you listen to his sent one, the Messiah, because in the Messiah is where we find resurrection and eternal life. Sometimes we overemphasize death in this world because we think it is the end, but it is not the end. It is only a darkness between 2 days. Our focus should be on the future ahead beyond the grave, right? And in fact, when Yeshua says this to that disciple, he's actually in line with halakha. Because Jewish halakha says the following. This is based upon the Talmud in Ketubos, page 17a. It says, gives us a hypothetical situation, right? Say now you're on the highway and you come to a four-way stop. And there are 3 different processions that find each other at the four-way stop. And it's like South Africa. No one knows who to go first. Who's supposed to go first? There's a procession for a king. There's a procession for a bride on the way to her wedding. And there's a procession for a group of a family on their way to a funeral. Okay, so who takes precedence over who? So it says, when it comes to the bride on the way to a wedding and the funeral procession on the way to the funeral, the bride takes precedence because we first honor the living before we honor the dead. Okay, so this is what's happening with Rivka, with Rebecca. She's on her way to the wedding. So that takes preference over honor to the dead. But even beyond that, look at what Yeshua said here. The Talmud goes on to say, but both of these parties, the funeral party and the wedding party, they have to wait for the king of Israel. The king takes precedence over both of them. And I think that's what Yeshua was talking about. And how much more so when it comes to Yeshua. If he is the descendant of King David who's going to sit on the Davidic throne, then any disciple that follows him should be thinking, this, following Yeshua, takes precedence over anything else in this life. So I think the reason why Rebecca leaves immediately is because of what was awaiting for her at this wedding. Under the chuppah, getting married to Yitzchak Avinu, Yitzchak Isaac, our father. She was going to enter Sarah's tent. And we know about the 3 miracles that were restored when she entered Sarah's tent. She reignited the flame that would last from Shabbos to Shabbos. She rebaked the challah, which was fresh week in and week out. And thirdly, and most importantly, the divine presence of God rested upon Sarah's tent in a cloud. When she got married and entered that tent, the Shekhinah, the dwelling presence of God, was once again here with us on earth. Isn't that what King Messiah is supposed to bring to us? So when she did that, she preserved the promises that God had made to Isaac to Abraham through his seed Isaac, and eventually through this seed that we're focusing on, which is, of course, specifically the Messiah, the King of Israel. She was on her way towards making the genealogy of King Messiah. That's why she couldn't wait to go and do the mourning for her father. So what's the lesson in all of this? I don't think the lesson is that you should now bunk any funeral you can. Now you have an excuse. Although it would be nice to use it, right? The lesson is to see beyond the funerals in this world that we attend. To see beyond death when it's staring us in the face. Because the name of the parasha is Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, even though it talks about her death. And many of our commentators point out that in the beginning, the very first verse of the parasha, twice does it mention Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah. Only once does it mention the death of Sarah. To remind us that we do have a life after this death, and that's where our focus should be. Nicholas just read for us here from the Torah about Abraham eulogizing for Sarah. And if you look at the Hebrew text in the Torah, or even in your Chumash, you'll see the word for eulogizing is but one letter that's inti binti teeny weeny, smaller than the rest, a little chaf. And our commentators tell us this is to teach us that Abraham mourned only a little for his wife Sarah. What does that mean? Was he a horrible husband? No, it means that he only mourned a little because he wasn't excessive, thinking this is the end of the world for her. He understood that there is a future light and a future life on which we should concentrate. Just like Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he says, We want you to know, brothers, brethren, we want you to know the truth about those who have died. Otherwise, you might get sad like others do who have nothing to hope for. We are not like that. We are meant to be children of Abraham. We do mourn, but we don't mourn excessively, over the top, hysterically. We mourn a little, like Abraham did, because we have hope. And that hope is in the resurrection through our Messiah, Yeshua. So even when we mourn, we learn from this week's parashah, we mourn with hope. Shabbat Shalom.